Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll continue now where we left off yesterday in this most revealing book, The Global Vatican. You looking for this global government that's about to take over, or it already has taken over? You want to know what the New World Order is? Listen to what this author says. He's a former ambassador to of the U.S. to the Holy See, the Vatican. His name's Francis Rooney. I highly recommend this book. You may get it from Rowman and Littlefield and other major book outlets. It's an admission and a boast that the Vatican controls foreign and diplomatic relations for the United States and pretty much the rest of the world as well. Now, we left off yesterday talking about the time of Vatican Council II in the 1960s. 1962, to be specific, through 1965, when it concluded. At the height of the Cold War, Roman Catholic President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, Cuban Missile Crisis, we had fears of war, nuclear annihilation, total destruction of humanity, and the ruination of the planet, if you can call it that. God calls it the earth. And, well, the world is in a hurt. The world is looking for direction. The world is looking for peace. And it just happens that all of these things led to a very warm relationship building between the Protestants and the Catholics in this country. The ecumenical movement. A global effort by the Vatican, with the help of the kings of the earth, Russia and the United States, to unite Protestants and Catholics. And with the help of futurism, obviously, it worked. And we'll pick up, backing up one paragraph for continuity purposes, the second full paragraph on page 121 of the book. It says, the day after the Second Vatican Council opened, October 12, 1962, the Pope gave a speech in the Sistine Chapel in which he linked the Council's aspirations to peace in a nuclear age. All right, the theme of Vatican Council II was saving the world from nuclear annihilation. He gave a speech in the Sistine Chapel linking the Council, that is Vatican Council II's aspirations, to peace in a nuclear age. That set the whole tone for Vatican Council II. It was an attempt by quote-unquote Christians, in concert with their Christian leader, the Pope, to save the world from nuclear annihilation. Now, to make the point, he points to Michelangelo's Last Judgment, that painting that describes in vivid color the horrors of hell. It's a hideous painting. Strikes terror in the hearts of any who look at it. And he admonished that the heads of state, that means the kings of the earth, must ultimately, quote, render an account to God, which means they must render an account to the Pope because he is the vicar of God on earth, and be, quote, ready to make the sacrifices that are necessary to save the world's peace, unquote. So this is, they set the stage for Vatican Council II as the last hope for humanity. And the Pope is the last hope. And he's admonishing the kings of the earth that they must render an account to the Pope and that they must make whatever sacrifices are necessary to save the world from destruction. And it says the alternative, the Pope said, quote, would mean the destruction of humanity, unquote. And obviously that implies global destruction. So the emotionalism Rather, excuse me, the emotionalism between Vatican Council II could not have been higher. It was the last-ditch hope for humanity. That's the way Vatican Council II was sold by the Pope, and that's the way it was received by those who attended. And those dictates were eventually, and are now currently, being imposed by the kings of the world. They are making the sacrifices necessary to save the world from destruction. And how are they doing it? Through war. That's why we fight wars. Now it says at the very moment the Soviet Union was installing silos, that is missile silos, nuclear missile silos, launching sites for new nuclear missiles aimed at the United States, the Soviet Union was installing silos in Cuba for missiles aimed at the United States. Kind of putting the feeling of imminence of global nuclear annihilation right at the time of Vatican Council II. How convenient for the Pope. Now somebody's going to suggest, Tom, you're suggesting that Castro and Cuba are cooperating with the Pope. Yes, indeed, he was, just like President Kennedy and just like Khrushchev were. They all work together. The Bible says, God's perfect word says, he, being the Pope, the Antichrist, the man of sin, the son of perdition, he reigneth over the kings of the earth. Now, was God a liar? Obviously not. Now, many of us are just having so much difficulty wrapping our brain around a conspiracy so vast that the Pope could literally be controlling the kings of the earth. Well, you're suggesting by that God's a fool, and that he exaggerated when he said, he reigneth over the kings of the earth. But here's one example where you just have to admit, this is just too much coincidence. We have the Cold War escalated by Jesuit-run communism in Russia. We have its counterpart by Jesuit-run Catholic America, and we have Jesuit-trained Roman Catholic Fidel Castro putting missile silos, all at the time of Vatican Council II, which says if we don't act, the world is going to be destroyed. If the kings of the earth do not cooperate with Vatican Council II, the world will be destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. Just too much coincidence. Now again, people say, no, I just cannot believe in a conspiracy so vast with stakes so high. Remember, the war that is now being waged on the earth was first waged in heaven, where Satan attempted to exalt his throne above that of God's. It was high treason in heaven. Satan tried to overthrow God's throne. And God cast him out of heaven and all the angels with him that were with him onto the earth. That war now rages here on this earth. Satan is still on the earth trying to overthrow God's throne. And he will stop at nothing to accomplish it. Now just remember too that Satan is a spirit, and he rules in the hearts and minds of men. And they get their instigation and their mentality, their rebellious attitude from him. So already they're in a like mind. All of these so-called conspirators that are so unlikely that so many could be a part of this conspiracy, how would they have time to corroborate and collaborate? How would they mask their communications and hide it from the world? They have a spiritual father. Okay, just like the Holy Spirit, who can independently work in the lives of Christians, accomplishing a goal called the kingdom of heaven, which does not require our instigation, does not require our collaboration or corroboration. We are all just of like mind. Likewise, Satan, being a spirit, influences his host the same way the Holy Spirit influences his. And so, even though it's so hard for human beings to believe in a conspiracy so vast, to be kept so secret, now you should be able to understand that Satan is their God. Satan is a spirit, and he influences them in spirit. Now, these collaborators, the President of the United States, the Premier of Russia, Khrushchev, and Cuba, well, Castro's Cuba, they're all Roman Catholic. And they're conspiring with the Vatican to prepare the world for a unification of all religions. That puts the Pope in the limelight. They're all working together. Now, he says, at that very moment, the Soviet Union was installing missile silos in Cuba for missiles aimed at the United States. 10 days later, on the evening of Monday, October 22nd, President Kennedy appeared on American television to announce, quote-unquote, unmistakable evidence of missile sites in Cuba. Quote, an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas, unquote. All the Americas literally means the Western Hemisphere. North and South America, Central America, Mexico, and Canada, and Alaska. Now, he says, Kennedy announced a quarantine on all Soviet ships approaching Cuba and warned that any missile launched from Cuba would be met with retaliation. I believe the precise exact words of President Kennedy is it would result in, what was it he said? A full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Now remember, Vatican Council II is going on, and the Pope has already hyped the Council's awareness of this imminent nuclear annihilation, even at the very time when they put missile sites in Cuba. Russian missile sites, communist missile sites in Cuba aimed at the United States. You talk about, I mean, the history of the Jesuits reveals that they never act overtly. They simply stand up all the stones and then stack them up in such a way that at the least provocation, they can just touch the stones and they all come falling down. They want they want a consolidation of all the religions of the world under the headship of the Pope, and it's going to take a threat of global annihilation to do it, and that's what they produced. A threat of global annihilation. It's all happening all at once. And it says the most dangerous international standoff in world history commenced. Okay? And it says in the midst of this, at noon on Thursday, October 25th, the Pope was on Vatican radio, speaking in an emotionally charged voice from his private library in the Apostolic Palace. He urged the, quote, world leaders, unquote, remember, he reigneth over the kings of the earth, Kennedy and Khrushchev, to step back from the horrors of war that would have tragic consequences such as nobody can foresee. So now we have the Pope taking to the radio in an urgent, emotion-filled voice, commanding the kings of the earth to step back from the brink of global nuclear annihilation. All at the time Vatican Council II is going on. Now, he said the broadcast was unscheduled, but the Vatican had already secretly sent the Pope's message to Washington and Moscow, where it met with approval from the President and the Premier. The day after his radio broadcast, the Pope's message was printed on the front page of Pravda, an indication that even within the Soviet Union, a communist country with a relatively small Catholic population, Pope John the 23rd's words were taken very seriously. Pope John words were taken seriously in Russia, communist Russia. Oh, the power of Pope John the 23rd, right? He says, certainly they were important and welcome to Khrushchev. Why do you suppose? Because Khrushchev is part of the plan. All right? The following day, the Soviet premier wrote to Kennedy to suggest a deal, the first real move in the de-escalating the crisis. Okay? You know, the thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. It's happening right before your eyes, right here in this book. Nuclear annihilation, global unity, and that's what we get. Okay? It is impossible to gauge the precise impact of the Pope's message on Khrushchev's actions. But evidently it helped create a space for the Soviet premier to back down from the confrontation while limiting his political liabilities within the Kremlin. No, he doesn't want to look like a traitor. He says he could look like a peacemaker in consort with the Pope rather than a weakling who conceded to the Americans. See, the Pope provides an out for the premier, the Russian premier. He says Pope John the 23rd is seldom linked to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do tell. But his role was important and may well have been decisive. Of course, it's very easy to put yourself in a position of decisiveness if you were the one who created the crisis in the first place. All the world's a stage. Now, indeed, it could be argued that this message and the exchange that followed sowed the seeds of détente with the Soviet Union, later successfully exploited by Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration. Now, I hope I don't need to tell my listeners about the extensive and intimate relationship between Henry Kissinger and the Vatican. But he is a Knight of Malta, and he is a servant of the Jesuits. He is the one at this particular time who helped to determine foreign and domestic policy for the United States on behalf of the Pope. He's also been a legal advisor to the papacy, and I think even financial advisor to the Vatican, to the papacy. Now, Henry Kissinger is a sword in the hand of the Pope. Now, much to the consternation of the Kennedy administration, John the 23rd continued to seek dialogue with the Soviets after the missile crisis. Nikita Khrushchev, in turn, seemed to develop a genuine, if grudging, admiration for the Pope, in contradistinction to Joseph Stalin's contempt. Obviously, that contempt was staged, too, because Stalin was a Jesuit priest. Now, it says, near the end of 1962, the Soviet premier would tell Norman Cousins, the editor of the Saturday Review, who became, for a time in the 60s, an unlikely liaison among the Vatican, Moscow, and Washington, that he would never convert the Pope to communism, and the Pope would never convert him to Catholicism. Now, listen to this, quote, "But stranger things have happened," unquote, added Khrushchev. This is a way of admitting that Khrushchev was Catholic all along, just like Stalin was, and that he was already Catholic. He was already doing what the Pope intended for him to do. Okay? Near the end of 1962, the Soviet premier would tell Norman Cousins, the editor of the Saturday Review, that he would never convert the Pope to communism, and the Pope would never convert him to Catholicism. But stranger things have happened. See how these guys play the game? It's a game to them. It's fun, and it's humorous to them. Khrushchev, by saying, but stranger things have happened, you can conceive as an admission. And they got by with it. That's why they can joke about it. I'll never convert the Pope to communism, and he'll never convert me to Roman Catholicism, but stranger things have happened. You got to admit, they've got wonderful senses of humor. If they weren't so diabolical. Absolute diabolical. They've deceived the whole world. They pitted us at the brink of war at tremendous personal expense to each and every one of us. Never once admitting what the real motivation behind it all is. It's to unite the world in a global religion under the papacy. And he truly does. The papacy truly does reign over the kings of the earth. It's not an exaggeration. It's facts on the ground reality. And we better wise up to it. He reigns as much over the kings of the earth today as he did during the old world order. And they didn't remain kings if they ran counter to the papacy. They were assassinated. They were brought into war. They were led into civil war, Catholics against Protestants. They had their crowns removed, and they had to travel to the Vatican to make recompense to the Pope for their errors. The world was completely governed by the papacy until the Protestant Reformation. And only then did we enjoy briefly some liberty. But that old world order is being restored to a greater extent and more powerful than it even was during the old world order. And it's all done in the name of democracy and progress. It's all done with Protestant eyes watching. And nobody comprehends, and nobody screams the alarm. All right, 5 months after this Cuban Missile Crisis, on March 7th, 1963, Pope John stunned the world by welcoming Khrushchev's daughter and son-in-law, Alexei Adzubai, who was the editor of a major Soviet propaganda magazine, Izvestia, to the Vatican. That's right. The Pope's meeting with the daughter and the son-in-law of Khrushchev. It says the meeting was the first between a high-level Soviet communist and the Pope. It lasted a mere 18 minutes. But to some in the Kennedy administration, this was enough to suggest further papal appeasement with the enemy, the so-called enemy. But I wonder if this meeting of the Pope, John the 23rd, the ecumenical Pope, the Vatican Council II Pope, meeting so soon with a high-level representative of the Soviet government wasn't a betrayal in Kennedy's mind. I wonder if this is when Kennedy seemed to have his Protestant moment and began to turn on the papacy, to attempt to close its Federal Reserve Bank, its Jesuit bank, determined to destroy the CIA and to make war against Castro. I wonder if this is what turned Kennedy against the papacy. Stranger things have happened, right? We've come upon the break. We'll return to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio right after these messages. We'll be right back.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you wish to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you wish to contact me directly, please do so. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Now we'll continue where we left off before the break. Pope John the 23rd, the hero of Vatican Council II, the God of this world, soon surprised the world again with another papal encyclical. He's taken advantage of his starship. He's helped to avert a global nuclear annihilation between the Soviet Union with Soviet Union, Cuba against the United States. And he's the world's hero, man. Vatican Council II united all the Christians. We're no longer Catholics and Protestants. We're ecumenical evangelibellies. All right. Pope John the 23rd, taking advantage of center stage, soon surprised the world again with Pacem in Terris. Pacem in Terris. That was the name of the encyclical. It literally means peace in earth. Peace in earth. Issued on April 11th, 1963, the encyclical was a call for, quote, peace in the atomic age, unquote. Still capitalizing on the threat of global nuclear annihilation. That's how the New York Times described it. Peace in an atomic age. But that was just one of the many notions it encompassed. One of the many notions the encyclical encompassed. Addressed to, quote, all men of goodwill. Remember, it's not just to Catholics he's speaking now. He's speaking to Protestants and all the other religions of the world. So he can't call them Catholics, but he is addressing them as all men of goodwill. That is, those other religions that are not true religions, but have goodwill now toward the Vatican. You see, if you're described these days as one having goodwill, it literally means that you have goodwill or ecumenical spirit toward the Vatican. You're part of the Pope's global religion. Now, you're going to see the word, the men of goodwill, or those of goodwill, used repeatedly in papal encyclicals. Pope Benedict XVI used it. Pope John Paul II used it. The current Pope addresses all men of goodwill. This is a code word for those who are going along with the New World Order. You must have goodwill toward Rome in order to have goodwill toward the New World Order. So look at who he's addressing. All men of goodwill. And the author even admits in parentheses here, rather than Catholics alone. Remember, this is an ecumenical world. It's totally apostate now. Remember, the Bible says men's hearts will get worse and worse toward the end? This is evidence of it. Now the Antichrist of the Bible addresses all men of goodwill. Those are those in the world who are going along with the New World Order. That's who the papal encyclicals are addressed to now. Addressed to, quote, all men of goodwill, unquote, rather than Catholics, Pacem, that is the encyclical, Pacem in Terris, opened with a paean to inalienable rights. And you thought inalienable rights was a Protestant Protestant realm of thinking. Inalienable rights? Look, now we have the Antichrist deciding what are inalienable rights. He's taking the Protestant tenets of inalienable rights and ascribing them to his jurisdiction. He's doing it in a papal encyclical that is spread all over the world. All right? Addressing everyone in the world that is men of goodwill going along with the New World Order. It was a song of praise to inalienable rights. Quote, the world's creator has stamped man's innermost being with an order revealed to man by his conscience. Okay? And his conscience insists on his preserving it, unquote. You know what this represents? It represents the papacy has now become Lord of the conscience in the New World Order. Quote, the world's creator has stamped man's innermost being with an order revealed to man by his conscience, and his conscience insists on his preserving it, unquote. The Pope went on to list numerous rights that naturally belong to all humans, from the, quote, right of bodily integrity, unquote, whatever that means, to the rights of free speech and freedom of worship. Now, let me tell you something. If you know anything about papal history, the Vatican has never honored any right called free speech, nor has it ever acknowledged the so-called Protestant tenet of freedom of religion. You were either Catholic or you were toast. You either sang the praises of the papacy or you kept your mouth shut or you'd be hauled into the Inquisition. Has the Roman Catholic Church really changed, or is the papacy just using a Protestant tact? now that Protestants are being invited into the Roman Catholic Church. You be the judge. Is this Pope now speaking like a Protestant and taking upon himself the jurisdiction of Protestant conscience by preaching monarchism and by preaching the fires of the Inquisition, which drove the Protestants to protest anyway in the first place during the Old World Order? No, he's trying to be a better Protestant than most. Okay, it's a show. I mean, you can't have the unity of the Protestants back into the Roman Catholic Church without speaking their language. But at the same time, he's taking these rights and putting them under his jurisdiction. In other words, you can be an ecumenical evangelibelly, but you're still going to do it on the papacy's terms. See, the papacy hasn't lost any of its monarchical attitude. It's just found a more pleasing way to take it unto itself in a non-Catholic world. All right, if these rights bear an uncanny resemblance to those enumerated by America's founding fathers, it is because, as discussed in earlier chapters, they are derived from a similar understanding of humans' capacity for moral reason. Reason allows humans to recognize certain absolute and inviolable truths, and recognition of these truths compels the rational person to follow their accords and to behave morally. The same goes for the governments composed of and for rational humans. They are compelled by reason to recognize and observe the dictates of natural law. All right, now the Pope is not only Lord over your conscience and deciding what is conscientious and what is not, but now he's even dictating over the natural law. You see why they call him the God of this world? Natural law and the conscience of human beings now belongs under the jurisdiction of the papacy. He is the one that determines what inalienable human rights will and will not be. As well as dictating your conscience, he now also defines the natural law. He says, as Father Drew Christensen, S.J., which means he's a Jesuit priest, former editor of America, that is the Jesuit rag, America, told me, Pacem in Terris is the linchpin of modern Vatican diplomacy. Okay? So this encyclical, but John the 23rd, is very, very important and consequential to the lives of every human being. And it really constitutes, according to this Jesuit priest who wrote it, it is the linchpin of modern Vatican diplomacy. If you want to know how the Vatican operates today, you have a working knowledge of and understanding of Pacem in Terris, this papal encyclical. Quote, it is the document for the Church's political reality, unquote, said Christendom. Quote, it establishes, Pacem in Terris establishes political theology on a cosmopolitan basis. You know what political theology means? Church-state. Political theology, church-state. It's a global union of church-state. That's what the New World Order is. The church defines natural rights, the conscience of man, and the state enforces it, just like the Old World Order. Okay? Got to know how to read Pope speak. It established political theology on a cosmopolitan basis. Now, the root of everything, according to this Jesuit priest, is the person. Okay, I could get into a huge discussion about that right now, but I'll just continue reading and I'll explain later. Now, the root of everything is the person, which the state is responsible to protect. Pacem in Terris really launched the church involvement in the human rights movement, unquote. Pacem in Terris is the linchpin of papal diplomacy in the world. It establishes the papacy as the dictator of human rights. Pacem in Terris is how the papacy is going to operate from now on, post-Vatican Council II. It establishes and defines what the person is, and that the person is a ward of the state, and it is the state's responsibility to protect and provide for that person. Now, Nicholas might even want to jump in here. We're running out of time, but the person is not you. The person is a creation of the Vatican, and it is paper, essentially. It's created when you're born. Your mother went to the hospital, delivered you on a delivery table. The doctor put your footprint on a document called the Certificate of Live Birth. Okay? Then that Certificate of Live Birth went from the administrator of the hospital to the state. And the state took it, put it in a file. That is, that piece of paper representing you becomes property of the state. Then the state issues a birth certificate. That goes back to the administrator of the hospital. The administrator of the hospital gives that to your mother. That's a receipt. Thank you very much. We've taken your live progeny and put it in our warehouse, and here's the receipt. Now, naturally, the mother decides, not knowing what has just happened, takes the baby home, educates, finances, and cares for the child all of her life, but the baby belongs to the state, and the state governs its affairs. It's under the complete control, just as lost property becomes a ward of the state. It becomes the state's business to take care of lost property. Kind of like a ship lost at sea. And unless the parents go to the state and claim that child, or later in life the child grows to be of legal age and claims himself to be alive, that child is regarded as dead to the world and a permanent ward of the state. No one ever does this. We're never told we can't. We're never told we should. And so every living man literally wanders through this world conducting his own affairs, but he does so at the indulgence of the state. And at any time during that child's life, if the parent is regarded as a heretic by the state, or by the church rather, and then implemented by the state can come in and take the child in custody and can arrest the parents for bringing up the child a heretic. And they can use any pretense for that. Abuse, you name it. Any justification at all. The state can literally come and take physical possession of the child and put it in someone else's custody because it belongs to the state. Did you know you were state property? I didn't know I was state property until a couple years ago. But that's what Rome created. You see, if one creates something, then one is the Lord over it. God created the heavens and the earth and all that in them is, and he is Lord of all of it. But if the papacy, the God of this world, creates something known as the person, he becomes the natural Lord over it. And as long as we continue to identify ourselves with it, then we have voluntarily submitted to the papacy's authority, and that means we have voluntarily submitted to the civil authority, which is the administrator for the papacy. Many of you are hearing this for the first time and think Tom has absolutely lost his mind. No, the papacy has lost its mind. The civil authority has lost its mind. And we are just finding out about it. And you're going to find out Tom Ferris isn't the only one that knows about it. And there are many that are far more educated on these lines than I am, and I will allow them to speak at whatever opportunity they choose to come on the broadcast and speak about it. But the Bible says we are all born in trespasses and sins. We are all born dead in trespasses and sins, and we must be reborn. The Vatican is playing on those words. And so when we are born, we are taken into their possession, determined as dead, until we come forward and proclaim our living status and take upon ourselves our own identity, our living identity, and literally retire the person, the piece of paper, to the one who created it, the papacy and the state. The truth is stranger than fiction. But after all, we're dealing with Satan. Satan who has no power over us unless we yield to him. And Satan has used the papacy to literally claim us as dead, already dead, until we claim our living man status. And he does it with the help of the papacy and the civil power. Do you own a piece of paper, driver's license, birth certificate, driver's license, with your name in all capital letters? That's not you. That's the person that the papacy created through the state. And as long as you continue to identify yourself with it, you're confessing yourself to be dead and in need of papal and civil control. You're submitted to civil jurisdiction, civil possession. And then all the laws that they pass, which governs the person, you are subject to. And if those laws contradict God's holy law, you must obey the civil law. And that's how Romans chapter 13 is now interpreted in the churches. We must obey the civil law. When in fact, Romans chapter 13 describes the civil law as the servant of God, not the servant of the Pope. Have I broadened your understanding a little bit? As Father Drew Christensen, S.J., former editor of America, told me, Pacem is a linchpin of modern Vatican diplomacy. You are a subject of Vatican diplomacy. It is the document for the Church's political reality, said Christensen. It established political theology on a cosmopolitan basis. Now the root of everything is the person which the state is responsible to protect. Pacem in Terris really launched the Church's involvement in the human rights movement. Simply telling you, After Vatican Council II and the publishing of this encyclical, you are now papal authority. He determines your rights, and he determines your destiny. He writes the laws under which you obey in the state of the civil authority, and your human rights are defined and warded and removed by the papacy through the hand of the state. This really constitutes the open declaration of a global church-state union. Pacem in Terris is a factual declaration of the New World Order. It took place at Vatican Council II at the height of futurism, at the height of nuclear annihilation, Cuban Missile Crisis, and every other kind of crisis, even during the time of the Vietnam War when the papacy was running a papal crusade against the Buddhists. And nobody told us. Our government doesn't regard you as a living person, a living man. It regards you as a person, a corporate fiction created by the Vatican. That makes the Vatican your creator, doesn't it? Well, they just used the word creator above here just a little bit, didn't it? The creator stamped man's innermost being with an order revealed to man by his conscience. The Pope's not talking about the God of gods, the God of the Bible. He's talking about himself. He's the creator of the person. The world's creator has stamped man's innermost being with an order revealed to man by his conscience, and his conscience insists on preserving it. The Pope went on to list the numerous rights that naturally belong to all humans, from the right of bodily integrity. You have no bodily integrity unless the Pope guarantees it, and he can take it away. Whatever you receive from the Pope, he can take away. To the rights of free speech and freedom of worship. You have the right of free speech as long as it doesn't offend the Pope. You have the right of freedom of worship as long as it doesn't offend the Pope. It's all explained right here in these 3 chapters. And it says, before April of '63, President Kennedy steadfastly avoiding any giving any hint that he listened to the Pope, but Pacem in Terris moved him to speak. Quote, as a Catholic, I'm proud of it, said Kennedy, and as an American, I have learned from it. Unquote. So the papacy, the Pope's man in Washington, D.C., in the White House, was proud of what the Vatican produced. Pacem in Terris, enslaving every American, making them the property of the state. And the state becomes the manager of the person in behest of the Pope. And what did Boniface VIII say? It is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. And that's the end to which they have been working. That is what they have accomplished in the New World Order. A global restoration of the old world order. Protestantism is dead. Unless God revives it. God hasten the day. That's all we have for Inquisition Update today. We'll be back tomorrow. Continue this most revealing book, The Global Vatican, by former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. See you tomorrow.